Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. In March 2017, Mont-Saint-Hilaire, Quebec. Early morning. A police officer arrives at an apartment building to accompany a woman who's here to collect her things from her ex-partner's unit. He heads into the wrong entry by mistake, costing precious minutes. When he finally reaches the correct door and knocks, a man answers. His hands are stained with blood. "Is that your blood?" the officer asks. "Number, it's hers," comes the reply. Daphne Huard-Boudreau was born in 1998 in Quebec. Her childhood was split between two homes. Her parents separated while she was still in school. Both mother and father remained involved in her life, but she learned early on that she had to build her own sense of stability. From a young age, Daphne learned to adapt, to be diplomatic, to keep the peace in relationships, among people, in her surroundings. She often spoke about her desire to work in psychology, to support people facing challenges. She didn't follow a rigid plan, more a calling she felt deeply. She believed that even a single kind act could make a real difference in someone's life. At times, her dreams sounded idealistic, almost childlike. Yet, they were driven by a conviction rare in teens. By age 18, Daphne had graduated high school and was preparing for the next stage, choosing her profession and living independently. She already had a part-time job at a small store to feel financially free. On the outside, she seemed confident, but those close to her knew she was fragile. Daphne was vulnerable under pressure, especially emotional pressure. She didn't know how to set boundaries, especially with someone she believed needed her. Feelings of pity, compassion, and fear of hurting others often outweighed her own needs. This made her particularly susceptible to manipulation. She seldom spoke about herself. Much more often, she focused on others. Even in her darkest moments, Daphne tried not to burden anyone with her own feelings. Antoine Pratt Lopez was also born in Quebec, but from near infancy, he went into foster care. By age 1.5, he had been moved through 3 foster homes. Social services had removed him from his biological family due to serious neglect, a lack of basic care, and unhealthy living conditions. These early traumas left deep scars. Later, psychologists would note his capacity for emotional attachment was severely impaired. Despite efforts by social services to provide a stable environment, the constant upheaval during a critical developmental period only made things worse. Antoine's development lagged, marked by fits of aggression and unpredictable behavior. Even preschool teachers found it difficult to connect with him. He didn't trust, never felt safe around adults, and perceived closeness as a threat. He took rejection deeply to heart, couldn't handle uncertainty, and saw any limit or rule as a personal slight. He lacked the skills to cope with inner distress. When overwhelmed, he either lashed out or shut down completely. As a teenager, professionals began to notice him more. Teachers complained about his behavior. Caregivers remarked on his difficulty socializing. But behind the aggression was a profound fear of abandonment. That fear drove his actions, turning any close relationship into a tense, unstable situation. He didn't see separations as part of life. They felt catastrophic to him. As Antoine grew older, he learned how to mask his inner turmoil, but never truly figured out how to manage it. Outwardly, he appeared composed, yet deep down, he remained the same frightened boy, someone who couldn't understand why he had once been given up and what he needed to do to avoid being left again. That emotional immaturity, concealed behind a grown-up exterior, made his behavior difficult to predict. Whenever he felt he was losing control of a situation, he reacted as though it were a personal catastrophe, often with sudden and unchecked intensity. By the time he reached adulthood, Antoine already had legal troubles, episodes of unstable behavior, a disregard for rules, and an aversion to authority. Law enforcement recognized him as someone who could react erratically in high-pressure situations. His record included notes on his potential risk level and recommendations for officers to exercise caution when interacting with him. Still, that designation didn't lead to any formal supervision or consistent support. In February 2015, Daphne met Antoine. She was 16, he was 20. Their meeting was by chance, but the connection escalated quickly into a relationship. Daphne was in her final year of high school, still unsure about her future, but eager to feel grown up and independent. Her relationship with Antoine felt like a step toward adulthood, even though the difference in their age, life experience, and maturity was obvious from the beginning. Antoine came across as attentive and persistent. He messaged often, called regularly, and frequently offered to pick her up or drop her off. At first, he seemed genuine and caring. For Daphne, who was naturally trusting and inclined to see the good in people, this attention felt like real affection. From the outside, their relationship appeared typical, so early warning signs went mostly unnoticed. Daphne's parents were cautious from the start. They were uneasy about the age gap, how quickly the relationship was progressing, and the fact that Antoine kept his distance from them. He rarely visited their home, and when he did, he acted reserved and tense. However, her parents chose not to directly intervene. She was no longer a child, and they hoped she would make wise decisions on her own. Daphne insisted everything was fine and didn't share many details. For the first few months, things seemed calm. The two spent a lot of time together, going on walks, talking, making plans. Antoine suggested that once Daphne turned 18, they should get their own place. He told her they'd manage just fine, that it was time to grow up and be independent. Daphne was hesitant, but gradually agreed. She liked that an older guy was taking her seriously, as an equal. She knew Antoine didn't have a steady job and was relying on financial assistance, but it didn't bother her at the time. He said he had health issues, and that this was all temporary, and she didn't press for more information. To her, the heart of any relationship was mutual support and understanding, so she made an effort to be patient. Even the fact that most of the expenses fell on her didn't raise red flags. During that period, Antoine started showing possessive behavior, but not in an overtly aggressive way. He became jealous of her classmates and acquaintances, would get upset about her social media interactions, and asked probing questions about her past. Occasionally, he told her she shouldn't hang out with people who didn't respect their relationship. At the time, this looked like typical romantic jealousy and didn't cross obvious lines. Winter and spring of 2015 turned out to be the calmest stretch of their entire relationship. Neither Daphne nor her loved ones realized just how volatile and dangerous the person close to her could become. From the outside, it looked like a standard teenage romance, full of emotion, plans, and hope. But even then, the groundwork was being laid for control, dependency, and blurred personal boundaries. Daphne didn't notice how her independence was slowly being replaced by a constant need to adjust to her partner's mood and reactions. Month by month, she compromised more, pushed her own desires aside, and began to equate love with patience, understanding, and self-sacrifice. As long as it felt like her own choice, not something forced, no one saw the danger. When Daphne turned 18, she and Antoine moved into a rental apartment. Her parents were uneasy about the decision, but tried to respect her autonomy. The place was close to her hometown, which gave them the illusion of oversight and proximity. Daphne wanted to prove, to herself and others, that she could live like an adult, manage her own life, and build a real relationship. But everyday reality quickly exposed what had been hidden. Living with Antoine was tense. He wasn't working or studying, and spent most of his time at home. This only intensified his irritability and jealousy. He demanded more attention, scrutinized who she talked to, checked her phone, and grew suspicious of anything that didn't fit their insular routine. His behavior fluctuated wildly, from excessive affection to sudden outbursts of anger. It quickly became clear that any attempt Daphne made to spend time outside the home or connect with friends would spark either hostility or sulking from Antoine. He insisted everything happen with his approval. Even short phone conversations became sources of tension. Over time, he started criticizing the way she dressed, how she spoke, even her facial expressions. Any small issue could trigger a conflict. The full burden of daily life fell on Daphne. She worked to cover rent and groceries, handled all the household chores, and still tried to keep their relationship stable. But the pressure kept mounting. Antoine frequently reminded her of a past instance when he had considered ending his life, using guilt as a form of emotional leverage. He told her he couldn't make it without her, that if she left, he might not survive. This made Daphne feel deeply responsible for his well-being, trapping her in a situation that was becoming more emotionally exhausting by the day. The first serious crisis came when Daphne tried to leave. She told Antoine she wanted to end the relationship and began packing her things. His response was chaotic and destructive. He wrecked the apartment, smashing items, throwing her belongings, and damaging furniture. Neighbors called emergency services. Officers arrived and documented the scene. Her parents had to rush in to help her collect what remained of her possessions and get out. Antoine wasn't detained. Law enforcement issued a warning and urged him to remain calm. Daphne temporarily moved back in with her parents. She was emotionally drained, but tried to keep her composure. Her parents, deeply concerned, offered support, but she avoided discussing the incident. She wanted to appear strong, like she could handle it. Internally, she was grappling with the devastating realization that the relationship she had poured herself into had become harmful. Despite everything, Antoine didn't stop reaching out. He kept messaging, calling, leaving voicemails. He apologized, blamed his actions on stress, and promised to change. He said he had acted out of despair, not anger. Eventually, he started pleading for sympathy, telling her he couldn't sleep or eat, that he was constantly thinking about death. He claimed she had abandoned him at his lowest, that no one else mattered but her. Daphne was torn. Despite her fear and disillusionment, she couldn't cut off contact completely. A mix of pity, guilt, and concern for his well-being weighed on her. She was too young to fully distinguish love from emotional dependency, attachment from obligation. Her parents tried to persuade her not to go back, but they didn't push too hard. They couldn't legally prevent her from reconnecting, and gentle reasoning hadn't worked. After the fallout from the incident at their apartment, Daphne attempted to maintain distance. She stayed at her parents' house, resumed her daily routine, but Antoine kept reaching out. He continued trying to rebuild the connection. In parallel, Antoine started trying to isolate her again. He claimed her family and friends had turned her against him, that they didn't understand how vulnerable he truly was. He appealed to her compassion, saying he'd get therapy, find work, change for good. He asked for one last chance, a final opportunity to make things right. For someone like Daphne, who always wanted to believe in people's potential, his words sounded sincere. She didn't want to believe the person she once trusted couldn't grow. When she went back to him, she hoped they could regain balance. But the situation hadn't changed. Calm spells were short-lived, replaced quickly by jealousy and control. He kept checking her messages, demanded explanations for her every move. Under the guise of care, he limited her interactions, criticized her appearance, and tried to control her daily decisions. The emotional roller coaster continued, one day filled with desperate affection, the next with resentment at any show of independence. Daphne became increasingly quiet. She avoided provoking conflict, stopped talking about the future. Her self-confidence eroded. She no longer shared her struggles with anyone. She grew reserved, withdrawn. She feared that another breakup might lead to tragedy, but also recognized that this relationship was quietly eroding her sense of self. Antoine sensed he was regaining control, but this time, it wasn't through aggression. It was through emotional dependence. His pressure became constant, though less overt. He used guilt, silence, accusations of betrayal. Anytime Daphne tried to assert herself, he would lash out emotionally. He made her feel that without her, he couldn't survive. That if she left, something irreversible would happen. This created a vicious cycle. Under these conditions, Daphne could no longer see the situation clearly. She lived in a state of constant tension, unable to fully believe she could walk away without serious consequences for him. Her attempt to save someone had slowly stripped her of control over her own life. In March 2017, Daphne made the final decision to end her relationship with Antoine. There was no argument, no dramatic confrontation. She didn't go into detail about why she was leaving. She had already tried too many times to start over. This time, she quietly packed her things and left their shared apartment. For the next few days, she stayed alternately with her mother and father. Her parents were separated, which gave her the flexibility to change locations and avoid being in one place too long. Antoine didn't accept the breakup as final. He saw it as just another temporary distancing. He continued texting her every day. His messages varied. Some were pleading, others accusatory. He called, but Daphne didn't answer. That's when he began reaching out to her parents. He messaged her mother asking where Daphne was. He got no response. Then, he started contacting friends and acquaintances, trying to figure out who she might be staying with. He watched her social media activity, checking whether she'd been online. His efforts to reach her grew increasingly obsessive. Daphne shut off her phone. She knew that any contact with Antoine would be a step backward. In response, he started acting through others. He asked friends to drive past her parents' homes and look for her car. He searched for excuses to see her, anything that might create a chance encounter. To him, her silence wasn't a rejection. It was just another obstacle to push through. Around that same time, Antoine found out that Daphne had started seeing someone else, Alexis. He didn't know many details, but just the idea triggered a storm of emotion. He felt abandoned, humiliated, and betrayed. It wasn't just that she had left, it was that she had replaced him. He couldn't process this as her personal decision. To him, it felt like a personal insult. His emotional state became increasingly unstable. In an attempt to express himself, Antoine recorded a video message and uploaded it online. The clip lasted several minutes. In it, he accused Daphne of betrayal, said she had used him, and claimed she had ruined his life. He insisted he had done everything for her, and she had just turned her back. He said he loved her, and that she had never appreciated it. While there were no direct threats in the video, the overall tone was unsettling. It was clear he was in a highly agitated state. Daphne's family was shaken when they discovered the video. Her father couldn't understand why the platform hosting it hadn't taken it down immediately. For him, it was another devastating blow. To see the person who had become a danger to his daughter attacking her so publicly. The video served as undeniable proof of Antoine's mental distress, his instability, his aggression, and his inability to accept rejection. In the days leading up to the tragedy, the atmosphere was tense. Daphne knew Antoine was trying to find a way to see her, but she tried not to show fear. She didn't want to worry her parents and chose not to involve them. In her mind, avoiding reaction would diffuse the situation. What she didn't realize was just how far someone unable to let go might go. The night of March 22, 2017 was cold and snowy. Around 2 a.m., Antoine left his home on foot and headed toward the house of Daphne's father. He didn't have a car, so it took him nearly 2 hours to walk through snow-covered streets in freezing temperatures. This wasn't a spontaneous act. He knew Daphne was temporarily staying at her dad's and would be leaving for work early in the morning. It was all planned. At about 3:45 a.m., he arrived at the house. Without alerting anyone to his presence, he hid inside a car parked in the driveway. It wasn't Daphne's own vehicle. It belonged to her mother, who had lent it to her while her own car was in the shop. Antoine knew this was the car Daphne would take to work, a shift at the small grocery store where she worked part-time. His goal was to wait for her and force a conversation. Around 4:30 a.m., Daphne quietly left the house. As she approached the car, she saw Antoine sitting in the back seat. He wasn't trying to leave. He insisted they needed to talk things through. Caught off guard, Daphne initially tried to calmly ask him to get out. He refused. With time running out and not wanting to cause a scene, she got behind the wheel and drove him with her. Silently, without a confrontation. Though he didn't threaten her or act outwardly hostile, his very presence was an act of pressure. When they arrived at her workplace, Daphne got out and went inside the store. Antoine followed. Her co-workers immediately noticed his behavior, tense, watchful, unwilling to leave her alone. The situation felt off. Concerned, they decided to contact emergency services. When police arrived, they documented his persistent behavior. Officers managed to pull him aside and talk to him. He wasn't aggressive, but he was clearly emotionally unstable. Daphne declined to file a report. She told the officers she wasn't afraid of Antoine, that he hadn't made threats or acted violently. She insisted everything was under control and asked them not to take further action. Law enforcement gave Antoine a verbal warning. He called a cab and left the property. The incident didn't escalate any further. Technically, he hadn't broken any laws. Afterward, Daphne looked tired but tried not to show emotion. She stayed on the job, completed her duties, and didn't discuss what happened with co-workers or family. Internally, she hoped it was over. To her, it felt like another episode, another surge of emotion from a former partner who would eventually move on. She didn't see it as dangerous. She didn't feel threatened, only drained, wanting to forget. At the time, no one around Daphne could have predicted that this was more than just a case of someone crossing personal boundaries. It was part of a calculated chain of actions, steps Antoine saw as preparation. He hadn't moved on. He hadn't let go. He was waiting for the next opportunity. Daphne, on the other hand, chose a strategy of silent avoidance. She believed that by not responding or engaging, she could prevent further escalation. What she didn't realize was that Antoine had already made up his mind. The following day, Daphne decided to go to Antoine's apartment to collect her belongings. Her main concern was for the pets that had been left behind after their final breakup. She feared he might harm them out of spite or desperation. She was especially worried about her two companions, a cat and several lizards. She didn't hide her concern from her loved ones and openly admitted she was scared he might, for example, throw the animals out or neglect them. Before going, Daphne stopped by the local police station. She told officers about her planned visit to her ex's apartment and made it clear she didn't feel safe. By that point, Antoine was already known to law enforcement. The officer she spoke with strongly advised her not to go back alone. As a precaution, a female officer was assigned to quietly follow behind in a separate vehicle, close enough to intervene, but far enough not to draw attention. Around noon, Daphne arrived at the building. The officer, however, made a critical mistake. She entered the wrong section of the complex. It took several minutes for her to double-check the address and find the right entrance and floor. Those few minutes turned out to be fatal. When she reached the apartment door, it was quiet. She knocked. At first, there was no answer. Then a shadow moved behind the glass, and a man's voice said, "Arrest me!" Antoine opened the door. His hands were covered in blood. Calmly, he raised them and told the officer, "It's not my blood." He did not resist and followed all instructions. The officer immediately called for backup and emergency services, then entered the apartment. Inside, all was silent. Near the staircase, she found a body. Daphne was lying on the floor. Medical aid was no longer necessary. It was clear she had already passed. Later, forensic analysis revealed that Daphne had sustained 15 stab wounds, primarily to the chest and neck. Her throat had also been slashed. One of the wounds was fatal on its own, while the others suggested extreme emotional agitation from the attacker. Everything pointed to a sudden emotional outburst and uncontrollable rage. The delay, the mistake with the building entrance, each of these factors formed part of a tragic sequence. Technically, law enforcement had followed protocol, but this case underscored a harsh truth. When dealing with someone potentially dangerous, even a small delay can cost a life. The scene of the crime left no doubt about the nature of what had occurred. Blood was found in multiple areas of the apartment. There were palm prints on the leg of a table and shoe prints near the entrance. The perpetrator had made no attempt to conceal evidence or stage a robbery. Everything pointed to a deliberate personal attack carried out in a state of extreme emotional agitation. Antoine was immediately taken into custody. At the station, he admitted to what he had done. He didn't deny the act or try to justify it. He simply stated that he had crossed a line and that it happened fast. He gave no detailed explanation and showed no signs of remorse. His condition was documented as stable. He had no visible injuries and declined medical assistance. As the initial interviews were underway, news of what had happened reached Daphne's family. Her father was the first to be informed. At first, he didn't grasp the full gravity of the situation. The call from law enforcement was brief and lacking in specifics. He was told there had been an incident and that he needed to come in urgently. It was only at the station that he received the confirmation. His daughter was gone. The parents' reaction was as heart-wrenching as one would expect. Daphne's mother was in shock. Her father couldn't believe it was real. Until the very last moment, they had hoped that the situation with Antoine would end without tragedy. They had known he was unstable, had worried, and had urged Daphne to be cautious. But neither of them believed it would escalate to this level. Authorities informed them that the body had been discovered in the presence of an officer, that emergency help had been called, but that it was too late. That same day, the family was formally notified that an investigation had begun. They were told that Antoine was in custody, had confessed, and was being held. Daphne's body was sent for forensic examination. Investigators advised the family not to visit the apartment while the scene was still active. Her father refused. He insisted on seeing his daughter. That memory would later become one of the most painful of his life. Following Antoine's arrest, the investigation didn't take long. He pled guilty to taking Daphne's life, and in 2018, the case went to trial. He was sentenced to life in prison without eligibility for parole for the first 18 years. However, the case sparked public outcry, not only due to the brutality of the act, but also because of how the charges were handled. The prosecution and defense reached a plea agreement. The charge was reduced to second degree, meaning the act was not deemed premeditated. From a legal standpoint, the ruling meant Antoine's actions were not classified as premeditated. But for Daphne's family, especially her father, the decision was deeply upsetting. He firmly believed the crime had been planned. The fact that the attack occurred just minutes after Daphne entered his apartment without a prior argument pointed to premeditation in his view. Everything about the situation, he argued, indicated signs of a first-degree crime. After the funeral, the family reached out to the Crime Victim Compensation Board to seek support for their loss and the trauma they were enduring. Daphne's father was in a severe emotional state, and her mother was unable to return to work. But their application was denied. Technically, her parents were not considered direct victims of the crime. They had not been subjected to aggression themselves, and therefore did not qualify for financial assistance. The decision came as a shock. Despite having lost their daughter to an especially brutal crime, they were labeled indirect victims and ineligible for support. The family filed an appeal. The process took time, but eventually the decision was reversed. The parents were granted partial compensation, mainly to cover expenses for psychological counseling and lost income. The financial sum was modest, but its symbolic value was significant. It marked an acknowledgement that the system recognized the weight of their loss. Meanwhile, questions were being raised in the media and public forums about law enforcement's role in the case. In particular, attention turned to the two officers involved on the day of the crime. One had been assigned to follow Daphne to the apartment, but made a critical error, entering the wrong section of the building and arriving several minutes late. The other was the officer who had taken her initial report and failed to strongly advise full accompaniment. Both officers later faced internal ethics reviews. However, no disciplinary action was taken. Officially, their conduct did not violate procedure. For Daphne's father, this was a devastating blow. He publicly criticized what he saw as a failure to recognize the danger. In his view, Antoine's history of emotional instability and threatening behavior, especially after the surveillance incidents, alarming messages, and the confrontation at her workplace, should have been taken far more seriously. He believed police could have intervened earlier and potentially prevented the tragedy. Years passed, but Daphne's family was left with a lingering sense that the system had failed them. They had not only endured the loss of their daughter, they had been forced to fight for recognition that she had been a victim, not of chance, but of avoidable escalation. No part of the system, Neither police, nor prosecutors, nor social services had stepped in time. And afterward, none had accepted accountability. Daphne's case became one of the defining examples in Quebec of how the line between psychological aggression and direct threat can be dangerously overlooked, and how hesitation, red tape, and lack of urgency can cost lives. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.